Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Martin Elliott. I'm a researcher at Cascade in Cardiff University, and I'm going to be chairing this afternoon's session. I'd like to welcome Rachel Hewitt, who is a Birmingham Fellow at Birmingham University, who's our presenter today and will be presenting on the Longitudinal Transitions Study. The presentation will be about 40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. If you think of things as we're going along, if you'd like to put anything into the chat, I'll pick those up once Rachel has finished. When we get to the end, if you'd like to ask questions, we're only a small group, so what I suggest we do is if you can raise a virtual hand, and I'll come to you and I'll unmute your mic and allow you to ask your own question. So I'll hand over to Rachel.
Brilliant, thank you, Martin, and thank you to Cascade for inviting me to come and speak today. It's fantastic to be with you all. I hope it's been a really interesting series of sessions, so it's lovely to be involved in the series of your conference series. So I'll just share my slides now. Okay, so as Martin was saying, I'm Rachel Hewitt, and I'm based within the Vision Impairment Centre for Teaching and Research, which stands for VICTOR, and that's within the Department of Disability, Inclusion and Special Needs within the School of Education at the University of Birmingham. So we've got obviously education focus with our research. So in VICTOR specifically, we undertake research relating to the social side of vision impairments, focusing primarily on education and employment. We also provide training for teachers to become specialist teachers for children and young people with vision impairments. And that's something that I wanted to highlight now, actually, for the context of this presentation, just for anyone who's not familiar with vision impairment education in the UK. So the majority of children and young people with vision impairments who don't have additional complex needs are educated in mainstream settings. And this is facilitated through support by specialist professionals, including these specialist teachers that we work with, who both advise mainstream schools on how to make learning as inclusive as possible for the students, but also work with the students to develop the core skills that they'll need, such as how to use assistive technology, how to get around safely and independently. So that's just some important context for you to hold as I'm moving through the session. Okay, so in today's presentation, as Martin was saying, I'm going to be talking about a piece of research that I conducted into the post-16 transition experiences of young people with vision impairments. So I'm going to start by just providing some background to the projects, the Longitudinal Transitions Study, focusing a bit on the aims of the study and its design. I'll then talk about some of the key findings from the study, and I'm going to do that by looking at the key pathways that the participants followed and their experiences of those pathways. And this is going to be illustrated through some video case studies that were produced by UCAN Productions. So I don't know if you know of UCAN, but they're a Cardiff-based performance and creative arts cooperative for blind and partially sighted children, young people and their friends. So we worked with them to produce some video case studies drawing directly upon the findings from the study. And then I'll finish off by looking at the the evidence, like just thinking about in the context of the evidence, what we can do to improve post-school transition outcomes for this group. Okay, so firstly, if we, I guess, travel back 11 years and consider what the original aims of the study were. So at the time of we began thinking about the study, this was back in 2009, there was government data demonstrating that young people with vision impairments were performing well academically in compulsory education. But once they were entering the labour markets, their outcomes were a lot less positive, and that's even in comparison to other disabled young people. But there was a gap of evidence about what was happening in that time in between. So back then, compulsory education ended at age 16. So from kind of 16 onwards, moving through to that time when you'd expect young people to be entering the labour market, there was a real lack of knowledge about what was happening to these young people. So the idea of the study was really to fill this gap, understand the different pathways that these young people were taking, their experiences of these different pathways, and to think about, well, to identify any examples of enablers that were leading to more positive outcomes, but also obviously thinking about the barriers that were preventing young people in fulfilling their potential and living independent adult lives. So to undertake the study, we worked with local authorities and special schools in the Midlands area of England and also Wales. So the local authorities, that's the where the majority of specialist teachers for children and young people with vision impairments would be working. So we were looking at those local authorities that were supporting students for their vision impairments. So that was one entry criteria. And the second entry criteria was that the participants were able to independently complete a questionnaire. With vision impairments, a high proportion of children and young people will have additional complex needs as well. But for the purpose of this study, we were focusing on those who would long-term be aspiring to be working independently. So that was a way of identifying those young people who long-term would be looking to enter the labour markets. At the time of recruitment, we also collected data from these local authorities of the overall population from which we were recruiting. And we found that the final cohorts who participated were broadly representative of the population, so a broadly representative sample. The research itself used a longitudinal qualitative design. So through this study, we spoke on the phone with the participants twice a year over the 11 years of the study. So the interviews themselves were mostly split in two parts. So the first part were more questions to track their transition journey. So we had some standardized questions about the different pathways they might be following, which we asked at each interview, obviously according to what the young person was doing. And then the second half, we moved through various different themes, which the research literature identifies as important in terms of positive transition outcomes for young people with vision impairments. So here we investigated things like their use of technology, self-advocacy skills, access to benefits, knowledge of specialist services, things like that. So these interviews, as I say, took place once or twice a year. Always, well, I did some in-person case studies, but predominantly telephone interviews, which were then recorded and transcribed. And then when interpreting the findings for the study, we've drawn heavily on the access to learning to access model, which is a model which was developed in vision impairment education sector. And that really, this model really informs our theoretical position for the study. So this model explores the role of education for preparing young people with vision impairment for adulthood. And it argues that there's a need for a dual model of access. So on one side, you've got the need to support access to learning, which is ensuring the learning environment is such that it facilitates the child's, young person's education. So your ideas of inclusion. And the second side, the learning to access, is about developing those independent skills so that the young person becomes as an independent learner, basically. So like we're looking at in university, we're wanting students to be independent learners. So the idea is that over time, the focus on access to learning will decrease and the focus on learning to access will increase. So as the student, young person progresses through school, eventually they'll become more and more independent. So for example, if you think of a child who might start in primary school, they might be provided with enlarged material for reading. But the idea of this model would assert that over time, the young person should be taught the skills that they need to be able to access that material without relying on someone to necessarily make those adjustments for them. So for example, they could be given a digital version and access it using some magnification software on a computer. So thus they're able to be more independent through their learning in the classroom. So this means that in our research, we're not just focusing on how inclusive the world is, but also been focusing on how well prepared the young people were to be independent learners in higher education and then eventually independent workers once they got to the labour market. Okay, so now I am going to talk about what happened to the young people once they left compulsory education, which, as I was saying before, at the time of the study was at age 16. So I'm just going to move through the various different pathways that the young people followed. So the first one that I'll focus on is sixth form, college and apprenticeships. So the participants in the study performed well in their GCSE qualifications, achieving grades slightly higher actually than the national average. And when we started the study, we asked them about their kind of aspirations for the future and what jobs that they'd like to do, etc. And at the time, there was a lot of optimism about what they would go on and do. After they completed their GCSE qualifications, the majority went on to sixth form and college, although some did choose to pursue employment or apprenticeships. And actually we had quite a high proportion who wanted to go on to do apprenticeships, but actually a lot of those struggled to find suitable opportunities. So they kind of had everything set to go on to do an apprenticeship, but when the opportunities were finally listed, they discovered that there wasn't anything suitable for them in terms of kind of their interests and location and things. So that led to a last minute change of plans, in most cases going back into college. So on the whole, things at this stage were pretty good, and I guess we were kind of thinking, oh, what's going on here? We were expecting to face the young people to face some more challenges than this, but there were some signs of some difficulties in what was happening. Of particular concern at this stage, we noted several of the young people were what we've described as churning in the system. So by this we mean that they would take courses in college, and then once they got to the end of the course, they then go back and take another course, most often at the same level, but some cases they even went back and took courses at lower levels. And this seemed really to be linked to a general lack of clarity about what they wanted to go on and do next. And it was a particular challenge for those who didn't want to go on to university afterwards. And they just felt they lacked that guidance on possible career options. And there also seemed a bit of a sense of panic from those around them, thinking like, we need to get you doing something, let's get you back on another college course. So there was that lack of planning for what they were going to do next. And many of them actually wanted specific guidance on the type of jobs that would be suitable for them as they saw it as a young person with a vision impairment. So they kind of wanted people to tell them, okay, you've got a vision impairment, these are the type of jobs that you could do. On the whole, the participants had positive experiences in sixth form, but I think college was a bit of a different story. Several participants reported problems in FE, and this was particularly the case as I had some who, as I say, kind of went back to FE later. And I think things seem to get progressively worse during the course of the study. For examples there include a reluctance from colleges to take them on as students, delays in receiving equipment, and just it seemed a general lack of knowledge of how to develop an inclusive learning environment for them as a student with a vision impairment. And at this stage, a small number of participants left college and became NEET, or not in education, employment or training. And that's something that I'm going to be picking up on a bit later on in the presentation. Okay, so the next pathway we're going to explore is higher education. And this was a really popular route with the participants. Around a half of them went on to HE, and it quickly became apparent that this was a really, really challenging transition for the young people, to the point that I pretty quickly decided that this is what I wanted to focus my doctoral research on. So I undertook my PhD alongside this research. And I just knew like this is something that I need to really focus in on. But to illustrate some of the common experiences in HE, I'm just going to play this first case study. So this is the case study of Jamie talking about his experience of studying in higher education.
This case study follows the experiences of Jamie in his first year at university.
I wanted to go to this university because it's close. The campus was dead nice, and it was my insurance choice because they had lower grade requirements. I had a meeting for disabled students allowance before starting the course. They suggested some stuff I should get, and they ordered it for me through this other company. The assessment was great, it didn't take long, and they pretty much got everything down. And they came up with stuff that I wouldn't have thought of. I requested stuff like note takers, and I definitely needed a laptop and enlargement software, and that's pretty much what I was given. It was meant to be delivered the day after I arrived at uni, and then it didn't arrive for the next 3 weeks. And even then, they didn't deliver everything, and the guy who delivered it was meant to set it up, and he didn't. He just left. So it actually took a while for it all to be up and running. 4 weeks. I got really behind in lessons. To sum it all up, when I went, nothing was really in place properly. I tried to get it sorted, lecturers and stuff, and nothing was ever happening. I wasn't even getting sent lecture materials, so I went to my disability officer, and she gave me the option, saying you can redo it if you're not happy with your grades and you think you've been cheated a bit. So I decided to redo the year, and I had to get another year on my student loan. So I tried doing my first year again, and it just wasn't happening. I wasn't really enjoying the course. So at Christmas I decided to leave. I don't think uni was ever for me, but my parents sort of pushed me down it. I would have probably stuck it out just because I invested so much into it. But it was a nightmare, and it really wasn't worth it. There were loads of things that needed to be ironed out, and you're always falling behind because we didn't think of this, we didn't think of that. It isn't just about putting a ramp on a building.
Okay, so Jamie's case study highlights, I think, many of the barriers which the participants faced when they went into higher education. Firstly, looking at disabled student allowance, which, if you don't know about that, it's a government-funded scheme which pays for equipment and support for students with disabilities. And I think it's important for me, first of all, to recognise that the participants viewed this as an extremely valuable scheme and absolutely essential for their participation in higher education. It enabled them to get equipment they wouldn't have been able to afford otherwise, and very much invaluable support in university, things like mobility supports, support in like lectures for taking notes, things like that, stuff that they really benefited from. However, many of the participants experienced real barriers in accessing DSA, and that was at multiple stages of the process. So they had problems all the way through, including things like the initial application not being accessible, equipment being delayed, so they'd be starting the year without their equipment in place, and then when they'd been allocated different types of human supports, then there were situations where they just couldn't find people with the skills to deliver on that support because it was quite specialist. So there were some real challenges to what was overall a really positive thing, but it didn't work for everyone, unfortunately. The research also identified a general lack of inclusion in higher education, and the participants' accounts, I think, as really illustrated through Jamie there, demonstrated how many of the institutions rely on making more individualised adjustments rather than having an inclusive approach. And I think a challenge here is that because vision impairment is so low incidence within the sector, there's a limited understanding of it, and the types of adjustments that need to be put in place, and just how much this can vary from person to person. And this meant that most of the adjustments that were put in place were more reacting to problems rather than that anticipatory adjustments that the Equality Act calls for. And a particular barrier that I'd note was that of exams. So many of the participants had problems with inaccessible exams, even getting to an exam and discovering that the adjustments that they needed weren't put in place, which meant that ultimately they couldn't complete the exam as they had expected. So as you can imagine, that put a real strain on young people at what was, for every student, a stressful time, but for them it made it very, very difficult. Then thinking about the outcomes of the participants in higher education. Positively, the majority did successfully graduate from their courses, but I've put a however here. And I think I described there, in many cases, the experience as more surviving rather than thriving. So it wasn't always straightforward. Many of the young people had to repeat years, repeat modules, or they were delayed in completing the academic year. So those people who got to their exams discovered they couldn't take it. They were then asked to take it in the summer holidays instead at the retake periods. So it really impacted on their educational journey. And those challenges put quite a strain on the students, and in turn that restricted their opportunities to get involved in, I guess, the broader aspect of university life, like those things beyond the academic curriculum. And you know, these are really important experiences, things like work experience, voluntary work, part-time jobs, getting involved in societies. Those are the kind of things that can really set you apart on your, like on CVs, when you're looking to demonstrate to employers the range of skills and experience that you've got. So when the young people came to graduate, they felt quite limited by their CVs as a consequence. Okay, then moving on to the labour market. So the following video case study, I think, again, illustrates some of the challenges faced by the participants as they were searching for jobs. So this case study is of May's experience as she was searching for a job after university. Ooh.
May shared her experiences of applying for a number of graduate roles as she was approaching the end of her degree. During her time in higher education, she applied for a large number of internships and graduate jobs.
The biggest headache with accessibility is the online tests that they get you to do. Most of the time, I get given between 20, 25 and 100% time for the test. Some companies are good in the sense that they'll just let me skip them because most of the time they aren't very accessible, even with the additional time. Especially the ones that have graphs and charts because it's difficult to see. A lot of them don't work with speech, so the text, it's not interactive. It's just like a picture, so even with extra time, I can't use speech software to read. A lot of companies don't understand. They just think with extra time, you'll be sorted. I got through the first stage of one application and then they sent me the test. And then I asked for extra time and they granted me that. But the test didn't work on my screen with the magnifier. I was trying to say to them, it's not working. And then they wanted me to move on to a different PC. I said to them, I can't really do that because my normal medium of working is working on my laptop with this certain software. That didn't really register with them. It was really hard getting in contact with the person who was responsible for making the adjustments and stuff. It got really tedious, so I ended up leaving it. Some organisations did make positive adjustments, allowing for telephone interviews rather than video interviews. I also learned how best to approach the organisation myself to ask for adjustments.
Okay, as illustrated by this case study, many of the young people face some real barriers in applying for jobs due to the accessibility of the application process. And even when they attempted to address this with employers, it really highlighted a lack of understanding amongst employers of vision impairments, who just didn't understand the adjustments that were required and why. And you know, I was talking to people who were very, very articulate in what they needed and really understood the different software and things that they needed, but this just wasn't understood by the employers. And I think this experience really demonstrated the importance of young people with vision impairment having those self-advocacy skills to both be able to challenge the problems that they were facing and also to explain the adjustments that they required. Although, of course, many of the barriers could have been removed through more accessible processes, which is the ultimate goal. Whilst this wasn't true in the case of May, a number of the participants also found that they didn't have the necessary skills for searching for job opportunities. So just didn't have the IT skills for using things like Indeed and LinkedIn and things like that, and for working through application forms to apply for jobs. And this meant that they became quite reliant on other people to help them search for possible jobs. But as you can imagine, meant that they weren't in a particularly good place for the types of jobs that they were applying for as well, to like in having those skills to work in the workplace. And the interviews also revealed a lack of knowledge and engagement with access to work. So if you don't know access to work, it's very similar to disabled student allowance. It basically pays for supports in the workplace to help persons with disabilities access employment. So this reluctance seemed to come both from hearing negative accounts from others, but also from their previous poor experiences with disabled student allowance, which had really put them off getting involved in this similar scheme. And several of the participants also shared a real reluctance to disclose their vision impairments. And this meant that they were less likely to request adjustments from their employer. Also, they didn't raise problems as they were occurring. And as I say, they were less likely to draw on access to work. And this was because they didn't really want to draw attention to their disability. And then further from that, there also seemed a sense of a general lack of knowledge of the types of adjustments which could be made for them in the workplace. So kind of a real acceptance, this is how it is, nothing can be done about it. Whereas in fact, I think in many cases, there were adjustments that could have been put into place if they'd been requested, and obviously if there was someone knowledgeable who could help support that. Okay, and then lastly, thinking about the young people's experience of being long-term NEETs. So a real focus of this research was investigating what happens to the young people once they become NEETs. So thinking about, okay, they're in this position of being long-term unemployed and not really engaging in anything that's going to help them progress towards the labour market. What support is there to help them kind of progress, move back towards becoming economically active? So the following case study shares the experiences of one of the participants as she was in that position. She had been unemployed for a while and she was looking to access support to get back into employment.
This case study follows the experiences of Eva as she tries to access support for finding a job after college.
I studied a vocational course in college, but since leaving and trying to find a job in that field, I've been informed by employers that I would not be suitable due to the health and safety implications of my vision impairment. I've been for a couple of interviews. I got to one of them and they actually sent me away because I was VI. They said that there wouldn't be anything that they could do for me. They didn't even let me try. And I also started another job, which they also sent me away from. I'm frustrated at the limitations of both the financial and practical support that I can access. Whenever I've tried to access support from the job centre, they've indicated that there's nothing they can do to help me. I've tried to access specialist services, but they didn't know what to do with me because I didn't have the eyesight. They were just like, "We don't know, we're not sure." And it's like putting me down. I went to this one group and I said to the lady, "Have you got any ideas about getting jobs for VI people?" And she said, "I've sort of drawn the line on VI people getting jobs. I think it's impossible." I was like, okay, thanks. I think people not knowing that blind people can do something, I really think that's because people look at blind people and just say, "Oh, she can't do anything. I've got to get her this in place. I've got to get that in place." I don't always feel confident to explain to others about my vision impairment and the adjustments I require. I'm frustrated at never really having had the opportunity to work or the chance to experience financial independence.
So many of the young people who became NEET reported a shortage of support available to help them navigate their way back into the labour market. So they just really weren't sure where to turn. I guess an obvious place to go there would be the job centre. And a particular concern is the lack of aspiration that came from those within services such as the job centre. So several participants shared accounts of going into job centres and asking for support to look for jobs, but they were actually told, like, you don't need to be looking for a job. You're entitled to these benefits because of your disability. This isn't necessary for you. So they were actively discouraged, even though they were there because they wanted help to find a job. And I think a particular challenge came to those who'd left compulsory education without having those necessary skills that they'd need to function independently in the workplace, and just not really knowing how to access the support to develop those skills, or even not realizing that that was a possibility. They kind of accepted this, this view that you don't need to work, you aren't able to work. So they kind of gave up on like the idea of being employed, which these young people were early 20s at the time. So it was difficult to hear that from them. But there were some more positive stories of support, and I think particularly from those who were allocated a mentor. Someone who sat down with them regularly and supported them through the process of applying for jobs, helped them talk through things, helped them think through those kind of key questions, like how are you going to disclose your vision impairments, when is the appropriate time to do that, and just kind of giving them a bit of confidence that they had got something to offer, that they'd got some fantastic skills, well qualified, that they really could do something with their lives. But I think overall the research has really highlighted just how vulnerable young people with vision impairments are to becoming long-term NEETs. So once they are in that position where they're on benefits, it seems very difficult to like find your way back to the labour market. So now I'd just like to focus on what the evidence tells us can improve transition outcomes. So I'm quite aware that I focused on a lot of negative things, but there were a lot of really positive stories that emerged through the research. But I guess by the nature of the research, we were looking to understand why young people were, the barriers, like why young people were struggling to get into employment. So I think naturally that has become our kind of our primary focus, but obviously we want to understand what can be done in response to that and what works for young people with vision impairments. So first of all, I'd highlight our end of project reports, the Lost in Transition reports. And in this report, we draw out the key findings, many of which I've talked about today. And at the end, we make recommendations for both education professionals and policymakers for how to respond to these findings. So I can make sure that that link to that report is circulated afterwards. But just to draw out some key points about what we saw really helps improve transition outcomes. So the first thing is inclusive environments. So as we note in the reports, without an inclusive social and physical environments, many of the skills and experiences developed by the young people with vision impairments will be ineffective. So those specialist teachers that I was talking about before, they spend their time with the young person, helping them develop these skills for, you know, accessing information, for getting around. But if the material given to you is not accessible, or if the environments that you're trying to navigate isn't accessible with things like tactile pavements, then it's not going to be effective. And through the study, we identified various ways in which the participants faced barriers in life progression due to this lack of inclusion. But we've also identified many ways in which they were able to fully participate through a combination of both inclusive practice and by drawing upon the skills that they've developed during their time in education. So I think a good example there is in university with online lecture material. Like, I think it's become a lot more standard now for people to upload lecture notes online before sessions, and for many of the young people that was just so valuable because they could, although they might not have been able to see the material on the screen, they could access it on their computer in front of them. So that's just an example of just the difference that more inclusive practice can make. Secondly, the research showed the importance of young people with vision impairments being given opportunities to practice the skills that they'd learned in less formal environments. And I think a really good example here is work experience. So many of the young people, they didn't get a chance to have a part-time job because many of the jobs that young people do during school aren't particularly accessible if you've got a vision impairment. So think about things like working in a shop, those kind of things that can be more of a challenge. But work experience was a fantastic opportunity for the young people. It gave them a chance to do things like learn to use their technology in a work context, learn to get independently to the workplace, and also, importantly, giving them a chance to practice explaining the adjustments that they need to others. So that gave them a really good basis to work from when they then were applying for jobs and things. It was a point of reference for them to think back to. It wasn't a completely alien world to them because of that work experience. A third factor is the extent to which the young people had a range of skills for independently accessing information. And the most positive accounts came from those who have developed a broad range of skills for accessing information, which then allowed them to tailor their approach to approach according to the particular task that they had. And I think a danger for people who are looking at, I guess, deciding about the support offered to a person with vision impairment in school is just thinking the goal is to just make sure that you can access written information. Whereas we really saw how important it is that they can't just access it, they've got a range of approaches. So if you take, for an example, someone in the workplace, who's got a severe vision impairment, if they go to a meeting, well, if we start first, the day-to-day work most likely be using a computer with speech software where they can sit there, listen to the text through their headphones. But if you say go to a meeting context, it's not really the most appropriate to be listening through your headphones whilst trying to engage with a room full of people. So there they might benefit more from a refreshable braille device where they can read through tactile inputs to follow the information for the meeting, but also listen and engage. So that's just an example of where we saw people thrive more if they had a range of skills available to them. A fourth factor is the level of confidence which young people with vision impairment had for getting around independently in new areas. So when we first started working with the young people, we asked them, like, how independent do you feel about getting around? How confident are you? And it almost came back like, why are you asking me this? Of course I'm fine. I've lived here all my life, it's no problem. But this story really changed when the young people started moving to new locations, and they were having to start applying their skills to a new environment. And as we note in the report, several of the young people struggled with that to the extent that they just wouldn't leave their immediate environments. And in some cases that really restricted their search radius for looking for jobs. So there might have been suitable jobs in a neighbouring town, but they just didn't have the confidence to get themselves there, so they didn't apply for those jobs. And then lastly, one of the strongest themes which emerged through the research is the importance of self-advocacy skills. And this extended beyond simply, I think you can kind of think, oh, it's having the confidence to speak up for yourself. But it's more than that. It's also about having the knowledge about what you're asking for, that understanding about, explaining the equipment you use, explaining how it works, explaining how to access it, for example. So these were really important skills for the young people to have. And along those lines, I'd just like to finish by playing this case study from Stephen. He was asked about how he would respond to a hypothetical situation where, say, an employer was questioning him about whether he'd be able to undertake a job if he could meet the requirements of the job because of his vision impairments. So this is a kind of a direct quote from one of the participants.
I would tell employers who assume that blind and partially sighted people can't perform certain tasks because of their sight loss that they're wrong. I would tell them that they're making some assumptions because they don't understand. The reason they think that is because they put themselves in my position and think that they wouldn't be able to do a certain thing if they had no sight. Well, what they don't take into account is the fact that I've been blind since I was 5, and I'm bloody good at being blind. It's something that I do every day.
Thanks. Yeah, that's one of our, a short quote, but I think it's one of our favourites, which has emerged from the study. And I think there's some really important words within that. Just to finish and say, if anyone wants to contact me, I've got my contact details here, my email address and Twitter handle. But yeah, I'll just hand back to Martin now for any questions.
Thanks ever so much, Rachel. It was really interesting, if not in places, as you say, a bit depressing, I guess, in some respects, but really important, really interesting research. As I said at the beginning, if people have got questions or comments that they'd like to make, if you want to raise a virtual hand, and I'll or put something in the chat, and I'll unmute you, or I'll read out your questions. Are you able to see that question, Rachel?
Yeah, so see, Jessica's asking why national services like RNIB aren't providing more employment support when there's clearly a demand for it. Yeah, I know RNIB changed their focus from, I believe, supporting those who weren't in employment to maintaining those who were, which was quite an interesting shift in approach. Honestly, I think it's money, it's resources. There's so little money for charities these days, and they had to focus their attention. But yeah, there's obviously a really clear demand for it. And I don't think it's necessarily just about employment support. I think it's about those wraparound services to help prepare people for employment. So I think it's going to be worse for those who acquire their vision impairment later and don't have those opportunities to develop the skills that they're going to need to like just be able to function in the workplace. So it's a real issue, definitely. I think there's more happening to that. Yeah, so Claire was asking for the link to the report. So if you just bear with me, I'll just get that link for you now. I'll make sure the slides are shared afterwards, but I can give that to you now. Okay, here's the direct link. I'm just putting it in chat now. I think you're muted, Martin.
There's always one, and it's me today. On a similar thing, I guess, I was wondering about the experiences of, say, a young person who went to somewhere like the Royal National College in Hereford versus somebody who went to sort of a mainstream further or higher education afterwards, whether there was a difference in the amount of experience and how good that they were advocating for themselves.
Yeah, I think this is quite a broad brush response in a sense, but I think the general pattern that we noted was that in terms of mobility skills, in terms of technology skills, and just having kind of networks to connect with and get advice from, they were far better placed in that respect for university life. So they kind of, they got a head start. They knew about disabled student allowance from talking to their friends, etc. The main challenge that they faced was like just adapting to being in a sighted world, and there was so much they didn't realize how much they relied on being around people who understood that they had a vision impairment and what that meant. And then they kind of get to university, and their flatmates were like, well, what do you mean you've got a problem with your eyes? Just get some glasses. And then they were like, they just didn't know how to respond to that. They learnt, but it was a challenge for them at first.
Okay. There's a couple more in the chat. So one of them is, did you have any experience with the government scheme Access to Work?
Yeah, we did look at this, but very few actually drew on Access to Work. So it was difficult to really, we got some evidence on their experiences, but not to the same degree as other aspects of the project, like disabled student allowance. Like the vast majority drew on it. But access to work, I guess the key finding is that they'll do whatever they can do to avoid drawing on it. Quite often big employers will choose to fund support themselves, and that seemed to be much more of a preference to the young people. They were really happy with how it went. But yeah, takeaway messages, they want to avoid it if they can.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Gary's raised the question about, did any of the participants raise independent living, i.e. preparing meals, drinks, laundry, as barriers to further education or employment?
Interestingly not, and that always puzzled me. I'm sure it was more of a barrier than some of them let on, to be honest. I mean, we did have, you know, specific issues like things like touchscreen, laundry machines, which were a barrier, and one young person managed to get support through social services to access it, the laundry. But on the whole, they seemed to be able to muddle through, I think is what I'd say. I mean, it's hard to unpick, like all students seem to muddle through that aspects of living, don't they? But I think on the whole, most seemed to be okay, actually. So it wasn't a particular barrier.
Okay, thanks. Somebody's raised about whether the presentation will be available, and Sian's responded saying that the recording will be made available through YouTube, and we'll make available your slides as well.
Yeah.
We've got literally a couple of minutes left, so I just wondered if there's anybody that wants to ask a last minute question or comment. Again, if you want to pop it in the chat and we'll pick that up. If not, we'll draw it to a close. Give you a few seconds to type.
Yeah, it's hard. It'd be helpful if you could see if someone was typing, wouldn't it? I think that's the next task for Zoom, to bring that in. Oh, so Claire, I'm just posting the link again to the report. Oh, no, oh, I see, it's gone to hosts and panelists. Okay, so I need to do it to everyone. That would be the problem. There we go. So hopefully you got that now, Claire. Brilliant.
Bro, lovely, thank you. Right, so as it's 1 minute to, I'll draw this to a close. Thanks ever so much, Rachel, for doing the presentation, and thanks everybody who's come along and attended today and engaged and asked questions. Hopefully you found it useful, and thanks ever so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone.